Hey everybody, this is my rather overdue at this point thoughts on the Summer Game Fest 2023 showcases and such, as well as some of the Steam Next Fest demos that I took a look at. And as I've done before with these types of videos, I'm going to go ahead and talk about all of the announcements and such first, and then after that I'll have individual sections where I talk about the demos in question, and there will of course be timestamps in the video description as well as in the pinned comment. So if you just want to know about any particular game's demo, then you can take a look at the available timestamps for those and just quickly skip to them. But as for the various announcements themselves, I'm just going to go ahead and go in the order in which I took a look at the various showcases and such. So that means we're going to kick things off with the actual Summer Game Fest showcase, which was the one hosted by Jeff Keighley, and as you might expect, it had a fair amount of cringe in it. Although it was certainly nothing compared to the PC gaming show, which is just weapons-grade cringe at this point. But anyway, that's beside the point. The real takeaway I had from the Summer Game Fest showcase, though, was a surprising amount of ambivalence. The vast majority of the games that they showed off, I actually have only 1 or 2 word notes for. And for quite a lot of them, the note was either meh or snore. That's not a good thing. That means that those games just did not appeal to me at all. They didn't look interesting, they looked boring, etc. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and list all of the ones that I just wrote meh for right now. So it started with the Street Fighter 6 and Exoprimal collaboration, which I don't care about Exoprimal, so that's not going to matter anyway. Then there was Nick Cage in Dead by Daylight. I don't care about Dead by Daylight, therefore meh. The Crossfire Sierra Squad PSVR game, don't care because PSVR. Lies of P, meh, because Souls-like, and it's also something that we'd already seen before anyway. Then there was Warhaven, which was apparently so meh, I actually don't even remember what Warhaven is without having to look it up, so that's definitely not good. Then we have Lord of the Rings Return to Moria. I wrote meh because yet another damn survival crafting game. Then there's Banisher's Ghosts of New Eden. Again, just wrote meh, and I don't really remember anything about the game, so that's not good. Then we have the Season 4 trailer for Call of Duty Warzone 2. Don't care about Warzone, therefore don't care about that. We have Space Trash Scavenger. Just wrote meh, don't remember anything about it. And then there were the games where I wrote meh, and then I elaborated on the meh. And the first of those was Path of Exile 2. I wrote meh, and then elaborated that I didn't care about the previous game, so I'm certainly not going to care about the sequel. It's a simple matter of, it's a Diablo clone, and that genre does basically nothing for me. Then there was Remnant 2, which is the sequel to Remnant from the Ashes, and at the time I was taking the note, I wrote meh because I still haven't played the first one. Since then, I did actually install Remnant from the Ashes and messed around with it just enough to get out of the very basic tutorials, so we'll see how that one goes. But I'm certainly not going to look forward to the sequel until I've had a chance to really dig into the original game and see what's going for it and what's not going for it, so we'll see how that one goes. Then I have a meh because of the gacha stuff on Honkai Star Rail. I get basically nothing out of gacha mechanics, so something that's built heavily around them like Honkai Star Rail or of course Genshin Impact, I'm just not really going to care about all that much. That's not to say that I will never mess around with, say, Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail or whatever other games they make, but let's just say that they're extremely low priority right now. The next meh that got expanded upon was Throne and Liberty, and that was just because it's a Korean MMO, and those don't appeal to me at all, both because they're MMOs, and because Korean MMOs in particular tend to be very heavy on the microtransactions and pay-to-win elements, and ain't nobody got time or energy for that. So that covers all the meh but expanded upon, so now we move on into the snores. These go beyond meh, they were just things that didn't appeal to me at all to the point where I was actually finding myself dozing off during them. And that category starts with the DLC and updates for Dying Light 2. I think that should come as no surprise given how I felt about the first game. Then there was Crash Team Rumble. Do not care in the slightest, was finding myself dozing off during that one. Then there was Spider-Man 2. I don't know about you guys, but I am basically completely burned out on superheroes at this point, whether it be in games, movies, whatever. And so I really don't have any desire to mess around with the Spider-Man games. I do have the first one for the PS4, but I haven't even messed around with it at all yet, and I don't even really care to either, so why would I care about the sequel? Then there was Pal World. Again, just pretty much dozed off during that. Black Desert Online expansion, I mean, that one should be fairly obvious snore as well. And then there was Marvel Snap. Just no. And then for the final snore on the list here, I have the Twisted Metal TV series. I don't care about Twisted Metal anyway, but a TV series that, if I remember correctly, is exclusive to Apple TV, yeah, that's a big nope from me. Then after this, there were a few that I actually just put the note insert shrug here, which is to say that I'm fairly ambivalent towards them, don't really care one way or the other, but it's not quite as negative as meh or especially snore. And those were Yes, Your Grace Snowfall. I haven't messed around with the first Yes, Your Grace yet, so I wasn't really sure how that one was going to go. I'm certainly going to take a look at Yes, Your Grace eventually, so we'll see how that one ends up. Then there was Under the Waves. Again, just ambivalent, didn't really care one way or the other. And Star Trek Infinite. Again, just didn't really care one way or the other. So that gets me through pretty much all of the stuff that I don't really have much to say about because I just didn't really care one way or another about it. What about the stuff that I actually did have more of a reaction to? Well, for starters, there was Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, which is, I mean, it's a modern Ubisoft game, so there's all manner of ways it can go horribly wrong, but it's a 2D platformer set in the Prince of Persia universe. It's nice to see the series returning to 2D platforming, but 2D platforming doesn't really do much for me, so I'm not really looking forward to it. I mean, I really burned myself out on platformers back in the day, and ever since then I've had a really hard time getting into them, so I'll certainly take a look at Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and frankly the rest of the Prince of Persia series eventually, but it's just not really something that's very high on my priority list right now. Then we had some gameplay shown for the upcoming Mortal Kombat 1. I really hate this tendency with naming games these days, and movies and TV shows and everything too. But it's really obnoxious with games where we're like, well, let's just call it, I don't know, Mortal Kombat 1. That won't be confusing at all. Let's call it Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Even though there was already a Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and then a Modern Warfare 2, and so on. It just drives me up the wall. At any rate, Mortal Kombat 1 actually looks like a really solid game. I am looking forward to it, although I do need to catch up on Mortal Kombat 11 first. I do have a copy of it, but I haven't gotten around to messing with it yet, and I haven't really been in the mood for a fighting game lately, so I don't know when I'll take a look at it. But Mortal Kombat 1, I mean, I enjoy the Mortal Kombat series overall, so hopefully Mortal Kombat 1 will be good. Then we have Witcher Season 3. I certainly enjoyed Seasons 1 and 2, so hopefully Season 3 will also be solid. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Then we have Witchfire. I am still really annoyed at the Epic Game Store exclusivity of Witchfire, because I was actually kind of looking forward to that game until they started revealing more about it, and the final nail in the coffin there was really just them saying, oh, by the way, it's Epic Game Store exclusive. As soon as that exclusivity deal was announced, I'm just like, okay, fine. I'll just wait until it's eventually on Steam, whenever the hell that ends up being. So it's just not really on my radar right now, but when it does come to Steam, and maybe GOG, if it does come to GOG, then maybe I'll take a look at it. We'll see. Then there is Sonic Superstars, which is just not really my kind of thing, but what they showed off looked decent enough, so there's that at least. Then there was Sandland, which I only wrote as, it looks okay, I guess. So I guess that really falls more into the ambivalent category, but it's more than just insert shrug here at least, so there's that. Then there was something that was just stupid, and I basically wrote down a note for it being stupid, which was the tease for the Annapurna Interactive Showcase. Congratulations, you have made an announcement trailer for an announcement. You might as well be saying something along the lines of, welcome to the Department of Redundancy Department. It's just dumb. Anyway, moving on, we have Party Animals, which I wrote down this note, and this is probably going to sound a bit scathing, which was, streamers laugh at the dumbest shit. Which is, of course, in reference to the fact that the trailer was basically a whole bunch of streamers messing around with party animals and laughing hysterically like the game was the funniest thing they had ever encountered, and yet the stuff they were laughing hysterically at being depicted in the game was just not funny at all, really. So, yeah, streamers laugh at the dumbest shit. Then we move on to Alan Wake 2, which I really need to get around to playing through the first Alan Wake. I have had a copy of that game for years and years and have just never gotten around to it. So, I'll certainly get around to it before I take a look at Alan Wake 2. I also will take a look at Alan Wake's American Nightmare along the way. Thing is that since Alan Wake 2 is Epic Games Store exclusive, it's been removed from my immediate radar in favor of whenever it ends up coming to any other platform, and that gives me plenty of time to mess around with the first game and the spin-off, so we'll get there when we get there, I guess. Then we move on to Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2, which, I mean, the first game was enjoyable. It's a solid enough game, so hopefully the sequel will be solid. Preferably better than the first game, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. And then we have another game where the note I wrote for it is also fairly scathing, which was John Carpenter's Toxic Commando. You would think with John Carpenter being attached to the project, I would be a lot more interested. But the note I have is, oh look, another fucking zombie game. Yeah, needless to say, I'm really, really sick of zombie games. Moving on, we have something I'm definitely looking forward to, which is Baldur's Gate 3. I have actually messed around with the early access build quite a bit, and what I played was definitely a very early build, as in the build that originally launched on Steam. I got it basically day one. And not only did I put quite a few hours into that early access build, I was actually pretty thoroughly enjoying it, so I have definitely been looking forward to the full release, although I will not be reviewing it on launch. Simple reason for that is, I need to review Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 along with their expansions first. And that's gonna take me a while, and then there's the matter of Baldur's Gate 3 itself being apparently an absolutely enormous game, so it'll be a while before I can actually get a review of Baldur's Gate 3 done, so I guess stay tuned for that. Moving on, we have Like a Dragon Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name, which looks thoroughly entertaining because it's the Yakuza series, and while I have so damn much catching up to do with that series, it seems like RGG Studio is just absolutely hell-bent on making sure that the amount of catching up I have to do on said series is even more than it already was, so we'll get there when we get there, I guess. Moving on, we have Fae Farm, which is probably too cutesy for me. I don't really plan on taking a look at it, but it might happen eventually. We'll see. It might be something I throw into a multi-game MTO, but who knows. Then there was Lisfanga the Timeshift Warrior, which is a neat idea, but I'm really not sure how the game itself is going to work out, so we'll just have to wait and see. Then, of course, there are the games that were shown at the Summer Games Fest showcase that I have very negative reactions towards. The first of these is Immortals of Avium, which, from the very moment it was announced and shown off, it just didn't look all that interesting, and then the more they've shown, the less interested I've become. And more importantly, when they started showing gameplay, it just looked outright bad, so I really am not looking forward to Immortals of Avium at all. Next, we have Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, which has the double whammy of being a shitty mobile game by Square Enix, and the more important thing being, it's yet another fucking Final Fantasy VII spin-off. And if you've watched my fairly recent Q&A video, you know exactly how I feel about Final Fantasy VII, but, yeah. Anyway. Point is that the note I wrote for Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis is, mobile FF7 bullshit, fuck off. And speaking of Final Fantasy VII, they ended the show with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I just wrote fuck off for that as well, for obvious reasons there. Then there was, of course, Fortnite's new season, as well as the Fortnite editor, both of which I also wrote fuck off for. So, yeah, there actually wasn't really much at all to look forward to at the Summer Games Fest event. And unfortunately, the theme of meh continued on into the Xbox showcase. I mean, 33 Immortals, oh goody, yet another damn roguelite. Don't care. Payday 3. I mean, Payday 1 and 2 certainly didn't work out, so I have absolutely no expectation that Payday 3 will work out either. Then there was Persona 3 Reload, which I wrote meh for because it's just a remake of Persona 3. I mean, I'm sure some people are really enthused about it, but I don't really care one way or another about that one. Then there was Still Wakes the Deep, which is meh because, oh goody, yet another horror game. I don't care about horror games, they tend to bore me. Then, of course, there were updates and expansions to existing games, the Fallout 76 thing, ESO expansion, Overwatch 2. I do not care about any of those. But they've basically become an institution at these summer game showcases at this point, so they're just gonna be there whether I want them to be or not. Then we move on to a game called Jusant, which I noted down as climbing the video game, and I dunno on that one. Of course, there's the typical Forza Motorsport that I do not give a single solitary crap about, and a cinematic trailer for Star Wars Outlaws, which didn't really inspire much confidence. I'll cover that more when I get to the Ubisoft event, though, because they actually showed gameplay then. Anyway, moving on, we have Kunitsugami, which just doesn't really look like it's my kind of thing, but it'll probably be fun for hack and slash fans. And the Legend of Monkey Island tie-in with Sea of Thieves, which is adorable, but it's not going to make me want to play Sea of Thieves any more than I already don't want to, so there's that. We have Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. I'm just glad that Microsoft is keeping this series around, but this type of flight sim's really not my thing. I am way more of a space flight and space combat kind of guy, and to a lesser extent, flight combat. So if they ever bring back Microsoft Combat Flight Simulator, then I might be all over it, but just the standard flight simulator, don't really care one way or another about it. Then we have Hellblade 2, which is taking an awfully long time to be finished, so I'm not exactly optimistic for it. I mean, I didn't really care much for the first game either. And we have Persona 5 Tactica, which I just don't really know how to feel about, because I'm not really a Persona guy. I've just never really been able to get into that sub-series of Megami Tensei, and for that matter, I've never really been able to get into Megami Tensei in general, so Persona 5 Tactica actually might have a better chance of keeping my interest, because it is more of a tactical JRPG, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that one. And we have Dungeons of Hinterberg, which actually could be okay. I'll be keeping an eye on that one. There's Cities Skylines 2, which looks like a solid enough city building game, although that particular style of city builder, where it's more along the lines of SimCity than something like, say, the Caesar series or something along those lines, it just doesn't really appeal to me as much. Then there is Metaphor ReFantasio, which bears extremely heavy Persona influences. And, I mean, it could be okay. It's not really the kind of thing I'm really looking forward to, but it might pleasantly surprise me, and we'll just have to wait and see on that. Then there was South of Midnight, which has a really cool art style, but the trailer tells us barely anything about the game, and certainly nothing about the gameplay, so I'm reserving judgment until I actually see gameplay footage and maybe even get hands-on with it, so we'll see. Then, of course, there's Towerborn, which it's a co-op game, and they tend to be compensating for bad gameplay decisions, so who knows how that one will turn out. There was the announcement of the 1TB carbon black model for the Xbox Series S, which is kinda neat. Although I still have absolutely no desire to pick up an Xbox Series S or X, and I actually don't have a desire to pick up a PS5 either, so this announcement was just kind of dead weight overall. There are, however, a few games that were shown off that actually do interest me. Of course, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, I've already mentioned with the previous discussion on the Summer Games Fest thing. I have a ridiculous amount of catching up to do on that series, and they just keep adding to the amount of catching up I have to do on it. Then, of course, they finally showed us some gameplay of Avowed, which is the upcoming RPG from Obsidian Entertainment that's set in the Pillars universe, which looks fairly solid, although I am a bit leery about how it clearly bears a lot of influences from Skyrim, because Skyrim is terrible, and while Obsidian has been able to take Bethesda stuff in the past and make it actually good, like in the case of Fallout New Vegas, After how weak the Outer Worlds was, I'm really not sure how something in the same vein as a Bethesda game is going to go from them. Guess we'll just have to wait and see. I am still looking forward to Avowed. It's just kind of a cautious optimism of it could be really good, or with modern Obsidian it could be kind of a mess. Who knows? Anyway, we move on to something that really stole the show for me, which was Clockwork Revolution, which looks very Bioshocky, but the developers have come out and said that it's not just a first-person shooter like Bioshock is. It is apparently an actual role-playing game, and more important to my interests, apparently not only is it very heavily inspired by Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which, if you're not familiar, is my favorite role-playing game of all time, but Clockwork Revolution is being worked on by In Exile Entertainment, who have made some of my favorite role-playing games of the past several years in the form of Wasteland 2 and 3, and the principal designer on Clockwork Revolution is Jason Anderson, who was one of the 3 leads on Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. Needless to say, I am very, very curious how Clockwork Revolution is going to play out, so I will definitely be keeping an eye on that one. Then, of course, they had a bit about the upcoming expansion for Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty, which apparently is going to completely overhaul the game, so we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. I did get my order in for the expansion, so I will be taking a look at it along with the base game. I have played through most of the base game already, so I actually do have a pretty strong point of comparison between whatever overhauls Phantom Liberty is going to bring, as well as what the original game was like, both on launch and now, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. That said, Phantom Liberty is releasing around the same time as Starfield, and I've already said that as soon as I can get my hands on Starfield, I'm basically just going to set aside all other projects and just go full steam ahead on getting the Starfield review done as soon as possible. So unfortunately, Cyberpunk will have to wait until after that, but we'll get there when we get there. And then, of course, there was the trailer that they showed for the upcoming Fable reboot, which didn't really show us anything about the actual gameplay or anything, and it just was really stupid and really unfunny, which admittedly is par for the course for the Fable series, really. But it did not instill any confidence in the upcoming Fable reboot whatsoever. Not that I really had any confidence in the Fable reboot to begin with, because, well, Fable series. If you're curious, go watch my reviews of those games. Suffice to say, they're awful. Anyway, the upcoming reboot just doesn't look fun at all, so I'm really not looking forward to it. I'll probably still cover it anyway, but we'll just have to wait and see. So that gets me through the Xbox part of the showcase, and then we move on into the Starfield Direct, which shows you just how much Microsoft is banking on Starfield being what basically carries the Xbox through this entire year, because their 2 big things were Redfall, which was a complete flop, and Starfield, which is undoubtedly going to be a massive financial success for them just because it's a Bethesda game. The thing about that you have to remember, however, is that it's a Bethesda game, which means that the likelihood of it being a ridiculously buggy, barely playable mess on launch day is damn near a 100% certainty. It's like 99.8% certain that it will be barely playable on launch. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes, of course, but given how absolutely atrocious the QA at Bethesda is, I don't see it coming out any other way. In fact, it's so much of a certainty, I'm not really concerned as much with whether or not the game's in a really bad state on launch, but just how bad of a state it is on launch, so we'll see. At any rate, I do actually have to be fair to Bethesda on some things. The first is that initially when they were showing off the gameplay, it looked like just Fallout 4 in space. From the systems that were included in the game, to the way the combat worked, to even simple things like them just reusing animations from Fallout 4, all made the game just look like Fallout 4 in space. Now, they've done enough different from Fallout 4 to where it no longer looks like just Fallout 4 in space. Now, how different it actually is from Fallout 4 is another story entirely, because they do have settlement building mechanics, although they seem a bit more refined and advanced than what we saw in Fallout 4. Admittedly, that's not difficult. Fallout 4's building system was pretty terrible, but anyway. And then, of course, there's the spaceship customization and being able to fly the spaceship and use it in combat, which is pretty cool. But really the main thing I'm concerned with is not so much individual systems or bugs and glitches and such like that. It's the role-playing aspects. How much of a role-playing game is Starfield going to be? Is it going to be like Fallout 4, where all of your dialogue options are agree to whatever the NPC is saying, act like you don't agree but actually agree anyway, or sarcastically agree, or the fourth option just being, would you like to know more? Damn near anything would be better than that garbage system, but it remains to be seen how much influence your stats, your background, your various exploits as your character, your reputation, all that sort of thing is going to play into the actual role-playing in Starfield. And that's what I'm really most concerned with. I want it to actually be a damn role-playing game, more in the vein of Morrowind and Daggerfall, and not the mindless action game with some very, very light RPG elements that barely constitute anything like we got with Skyrim and Fallout 4. Now, admittedly, from what they were showing off at the Starfield Direct, it does seem like they are leaning more into the RPG elements than the action game elements. But at the same time, it does seem like they're leaning pretty heavily on procedural generation, and the dialogue that they've shown off has been rather stilted, awkward, and robotic. So, who knows how it's actually going to turn out. I will be taking a look at it as soon as I can. I do already have an order in for the game. I will be getting it on launch day and messing around with it and getting the review done as soon as possible. But I will be fair and say that Bethesda does seem to be pretty ambitious with this, and it is entirely possible, very much not likely, but possible, that the game actually turns out okay. But unfortunately, we just have no way of knowing until the game's actually out in a couple of months, so I guess stay tuned for that video whenever it ends up happening. Now then, we move on from the Xbox Showcase and Starfield Direct, and into the weapons-grade cringe that was the PC Gaming Show. Now, one of the relatively few positives about the PC Gaming Show is that this is where you tend to see strategy game announcements and such like that, and you see a lot more indies being covered. So, that's nice, but even then, there's only so much of the weapons-grade cringe you can put up with from the PC Gaming Show. To make matters a bit more frustrating, there were a lot of smaller indie titles that were being shown off that are just in genres I don't really care about. Stuff like platformers and puzzle games and things like that. And of course, there were also some games that had already been announced well before the PC Gaming Show, but they had a trailer presence anyway, stuff like Frostpunk 2 or Nivalis, and there were a couple of trailers for things that had already been covered in previous showings, like Baldur's Gate 3 and Path of Exile 2, but then there were a couple of games that actually were kind of interesting. For example, there was Dorf, Real-Time Strategic Conflict, which is a very Command & Conquer style RTS, which is kind of neat to see, although Command & Conquer style RTS is not really my kind of thing. But hey, pretty much any developer attempting to do a classic style base building RTS these days is a very welcome sight, so more power to them. Same kind of thing with Stormgate, although unfortunately Stormgate is much more Warcraft or Starcraft-esque, and I can't stand that specific playstyle, to put it lightly, so Stormgate is not exactly on my radar, shall we say. Continuing on, we had a trailer for Road to Vostok, which is a sort of Escape from Tarkov and Stalker-esque game that, as far as I can tell, is supposed to be entirely single-player, which is very cool. And it's actually shaping up pretty well, but the development process for it has been very, very slow. But once it's had some more development time, I will certainly be taking a look at that to see what's going on with it. And then there was a game that I don't really have any personal interest in as far as actually playing it, because it's an action platformer and a fairly old school style one. But when I saw 30XX, the only thing that went through my mind was, fine, I'll do it myself, only it's Mega Man. Because that's just the vibe that game gives off, so that thoroughly amused me. Moving on, some other interesting games shown at the PC Gaming Show included Fortune's Run, which I've been keeping an eye on for quite a while. and they made a demo available, so stay tuned for my thoughts on that more towards the end of the video when I start talking about all the demos I covered for Steam Next Fest. But the short version there that makes that one interesting is actually how it's described on the Steam store page, which is a classic FPS with undertones of role-playing in the spirit of Deus Ex and I Divine Cybermancy, featuring the campy tone of space operas and titles like Metal Gear Solid. Needless to say, Fortune's Run is definitely an interesting game, so stay tuned for that section towards the end of the video. Moving on, we have Nahobuck's Dungeon Master, which is a very Dungeon Keeper-esque game, so nice to see that style of game being brought back. And there was also Shadow Gambit The Cursed Crew, which is, from what I could tell, if you took the gameplay style of games like Commandos and combined it with supernatural cursed pirates. Sounds pretty cool, actually, so I'll be keeping an eye on that one as well. But other than that, there wasn't really all that much that actually stood out during the PC Gaming Show, so let's continue on to the next event, which was noticeably lighter on the amount of games being shown, which was Ubi Forward, the Ubisoft presentation, which started with Just Dance 2024, which, well, that series continues to utterly baffle me. I don't know how it managed to stay as successful as it has stayed, to the point where Ubisoft keeps releasing a new one every single year and apparently is justified in doing so. It's honestly a bit depressing. Anyway, continuing on, they had Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which from what they showed and what they talked about is basically Far Cry, but set in the Avatar setting. So it's Far Cry, but dances with wolves in space. Ugh. Anyway, continuing on, we have X Defiant, their new competitive FPS, which I will probably try at some point, but I don't really care about it all that much. I think it's going to be free to play, so expect an MTO on that whenever it's made available. And they had a section where they talked more about Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, which I've already talked about. And they had a section on Captain Laserhawk, which is what they have decided to take Blood Dragon from Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon and make it into an anime for Netflix. I don't know. It could be entertaining, but it's probably going to be kind of a mess. I'd much rather have another Blood Dragon game, thank you very much. Anyway, moving on, we have The Division Resurgence, which is The Division, but it's for phones. No thank you. We have Skull and Bones, which I'm utterly convinced that Skull and Bones, whenever it ends up launching, is just going to be an absolute flop. It has not looked good at all, and the development on it has dragged out for so long that it basically has no chance. So I'm really not looking forward to that one either. We had some DLC for Mario plus Rabbids. Don't really care. We had The Crew Motorfest. I do not give a single solitary crap about The Crew at all. We had a VR entry in the Assassin's Creed series called Assassin's Creed Nexus. I don't care about that because I don't have a VR setup, and I probably never will. And then we had more information about Assassin's Creed Mirage. Now, I will be fair to Assassin's Creed Mirage. As stale and homogeneous as that series has become, if Assassin's Creed Mirage is actually a return to the stealth roots of the series, like they are portraying it to be, and it doesn't have the pseudo-RPG-esque bullshit, there is actually a chance that Assassin's Creed Mirage might be good. But we have no way of knowing until the game's fully out. So I'll definitely keep an eye on it. I will pick up a copy of it whenever I can find it for a decent price. And I have plenty of catching up to do with the Assassin's Creed series anyway, so in the meantime, until then, I might as well go ahead and get those out of the way. But for the first time in a long time, I am actually legitimately curious how an Assassin's Creed game is going to turn out, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. And lastly, they had Star Wars Outlaws, which, I mean, it looks like a fairly standard action-adventure game kind of thing. And, I mean, there's nothing really wrong with that, but it's Ubisoft, and I just don't really have any confidence that they're going to be able to pull it off without it just falling into the same tired traps that all of the other Ubisoft games lately have fallen into. Things like over-monetization, constantly dragging things out with tons of side activities, and just putting in pointless open world stuff and all that kind of thing. So, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see on that. I will still pick up a copy of it and take a look when I can, but I'm not really optimistic for Star Wars Outlaws. Continuing on, we have the Capcom showcase, where they didn't have all that much either when they were showing that off. They had the Kunitsugama, which I've already talked about. They had Mega Man X Dive Offline, which is an offline version of the 2021 Mega Man Gacha game. I don't even know how that's going to work, but whatever. For Mega Man fans and Gacha fans, I guess that's the thing. Then they had a whole thing about Street Fighter 6, which, admittedly, Street Fighter 6 actually looks pretty solid. I'm not going to pick it up until I can get a package deal with DLC characters and everything. Because, honestly, getting into a fighting game when it's fresh, when it's brand new, is one of the dumbest things you can do from a value proposition. Because you're paying full price, or very close to full price for the game, but then you have to pay extra for all of the characters later on. It's way more economical just to wait for all of the characters and stages and such to be put into the game, and get a gold edition or whatever they end up calling it. So that's usually what I end up doing with fighting games. And Street Fighter 6 is going to be no exception there. I will probably still play it and probably enjoy it, but I still haven't really messed around all that much with Street Fighter 5, so I've got some catching up to do there. Moving on, we had VR mode for Resident Evil 4 Remake. Do not care. We had a thing on Pragmata, which I don't even really know what Pragmata is supposed to be. The trailer for it more or less just announced a delay, and it didn't really give an indication of what the game's supposed to play like, or even really what it's supposed to be about, so I don't even know with that one. Continuing on, we had Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, which was a game that was stuck on the Nintendo DS, but is finally becoming available on other systems, so very nice to see a game not being stuck in the dustbin of handheld gaming history. We have the Apollo Justice trilogy. Much like with Ghost Trick, it's very nice to see these games being rescued from the death of the 3DS eShop, because in case you didn't know, Dual Destinies in particular was digital only in the West. The Japanese version had a physical copy, but we never got a physical copy in the West, so if you wanted it, you had to buy it on the eShop, and, well, the eShop is no longer a thing. So, much like with Ghost Trick, very nice to see them rescued from the handheld dustbin of history. Moving on, we have Capcom Town, which is their 40th anniversary celebration thing, for lack of a better way of describing it. It seemed kind of neat, just a celebration of the games they've made up to this point. Lets you play a few of the arcade games in a digital format. It's kind of neat. Not really the kind of thing that I'd be excited for, but it's nice to see them remembering their history and making something available for the occasion. Then there was Capcom ID, because we didn't have enough account registration bullshit to deal with pretty much anything else. So annoying. I'm so tired of having accounts for everything and launchers for everything. Is just obnoxious. Developers, please stop. Anyway, moving on, we have Exoprimal, which I have always thought looked pretty meh, and the more I find out about it, the more meh it appears, and the game is finally out, and I have no desire to take a look at it. And then finally, we have what people would consider kind of the star of the Capcom showcase, which was Dragon's Dogma 2. Which, as far as I can tell from what they showed, is literally just Dragon's Dogma all over again, but with better graphics, and now it has physics. Needless to say, I was not remotely enthused by that, because if it sticks too much to the original Dragon's Dogma's formula, then the pawns will be very annoying, the gameplay will be extremely slow and extremely tedious, especially with the amount of constantly running back and forth between one or two locations over and over and over again, fighting the same trash enemies over and over and over again, and just generally boring yourself into oblivion until finally you get to the end of the game, and you beat the game, and then you get into post-game, and that's where the fans of Dragon's Dogma will tell you the game really picks up, because clearly the previous 50-plus hours couldn't be fun. No, you gotta grind for 50-plus hours to get to the good stuff. And you know what? If Dragon's Dogma 2 is like that, then it can get fucked. And frankly, that is all I have to say on that particular matter. I will still be keeping an eye on Dragon's Dogma 2, and if I have the chance, I will mess around with it. But I am not remotely optimistic, and until I see otherwise, it's basically the same game all over again, which is not a good thing. But anyway, the last event we had for the Summer of Gaming 2023 was the Nintendo Direct. And honestly, the vast majority of what I wrote for this was just meh for almost every single thing they showed. I mean, I don't care about Pokemon. I already talked about Sonic Superstars. I already talked about Persona 5 Tactica. Myth Force looks just weak, and not to mention, it's one of those co-op games that's probably trying to compensate for crappy gameplay. There was a bit on Just Dance 2024. There was Gloomhaven for Switch, which is just a port of an existing game. There was the Super Mario RPG remake or remaster, whatever you want to call it. They're just calling it Super Mario RPG. I mean, it's the same game, but with better graphics, so don't really care about that. There was Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince. I don't really care about Dragon Quest very much, so that one didn't really do much for me either. You have Vampire Survivors coming to Switch, and honestly, I'm sick of seeing Vampire Survivors and wannabe Vampire Survivors games just showing up all over the damn place. I'm just tired of these kind of fad games that show up, they're extremely simplistic, and maybe they're enjoyable, but then all the copycats show up and just ruins the whole thing. Anyway, moving on. Pikmin 4, I actually have never played any of the Pikmin games. I have Pikmin 3, but that's the only one I've got, and I haven't really messed around with it other than just making sure my copy of the game actually works. So I might mess around with Pikmin 4 eventually, but it's definitely not a priority right now. And there was the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection, which is also getting releases on other platforms, including PC. So I'll be picking up the PC version of that eventually, I don't know when, and seeing what's going on with it. But it's nice to see the Metal Gear series is not just confined to the dustbin of history, and that Konami is actually continuing to make the game available. So there's that at least. And then there was the one thing that was actually kind of neat, which was Star Ocean Second Story R. It took them a really long time to get around to putting Star Ocean the Second Story on the Switch, because the remake of the first game, First Departure, got a release on the Switch as well. It was First Departure R, if I remember correctly, and I do have that, but the second game has been stuck on the PS1 in its original form, and then on the PSP with a increasingly difficult to find and prohibitively expensive remake. So if nothing else, it's nice to see Star Ocean the Second Story getting a re-release in general, but they've gone a step further and decided to do the whole 2D, 3D remake thing, like with the relatively recent remake of Live Alive. And so they're actually going a step further than they did with the First Departure R release on the Switch, which was just a slightly enhanced re-release of the PSP remake First Departure. So that's very nice to see, but I think it's saying something when the thing I'm most interested in on the Switch, that's upcoming anyway, is a remake of a game from the mid-90s. Now granted, I have plenty of catching up to do on the stuff I already have for the Switch, and there are a few games that I still haven't picked up for it as well. Stuff like Metroid Dread, for example, I still haven't picked up. But the fact that we've gone yet another summer of gaming without any news on Metroid Prime 4 is a bit concerning. and the fact that they don't really have all that much really big in the pipeline is kind of disappointing, really. We still don't have, of course, Fire Emblem 3, 4, 5, and 6 being made available in the West. We still don't have Mother 3 being made available in the West. Hell, we don't really have much in the way of Nintendo making really any of their back catalog available in either the West or Japan again, because Nintendo is Nintendo, and that's how they roll, which is just obnoxious. But that ultimately brings the various showcases to a close here. There just weren't really all that many games that really caught my attention there. Like I said, Clockwork Revolution is really the only one that I'm really curious to see how it goes. And that was just mostly because of the Arcanum vibes it was giving off, so who knows how that'll go. But the future of, or at least the immediate future, I should say, of the games industry, as far as these showcases go, is just in a fairly meh state overall. There's not really much that seems all that egregious, but at the same time, there's not any real killer apps that I'm really looking forward to, apart from Clockwork Revolution and Avowed. And even Avowed is just something I'm cautiously optimistic for. I'm not really super excited for it. So, I don't know, we'll see how things go. But in the meantime, I've got plenty of games to catch up on and cover on the channel, so I'm really not all that concerned that the next year of gaming, particularly in the AAA space, just doesn't really resonate all that well. So, now that I've gone through all of the main conferences and such, if you've got any questions about a particular game, feel free to ask. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the various Steam Next Fest demos that I messed around with. So if you're curious about individual games, go ahead and check the timestamps, but I'll just go ahead and get things started. So the first demo I took a look at is Beyond Sunset, which is a game built on the GZ Doom engine, developed by Metacorp and published by Movie Games SA, and honestly, I didn't really play all that much of it because it just didn't really click for me. It does have a very nice sci-fi aesthetic, but the main problem I was running into is that not only does it just feel like a Doom mod more than anything else, it was just oddly tuned in terms of difficulty and the way the weapons felt. I mean, the first weapon you get is a katana, and you can slice enemies apart with that, or you can reflect enemies' shots back at them, but they were throwing you up against an awful lot of enemies at once, where something like a katana just doesn't really work very well. And the first gun you have access to is a pretty wimpy pistol that just doesn't feel very good to use. So after a few minutes of messing around with the demo, I really came to the conclusion that while they certainly have a cool idea here, ultimately the demo experience really does feel more like a Doom mod than a proper standalone game that just happens to be built on the same engine. It has that cool idea, but clearly unrefined execution quality to it that hopefully they'll sort out more by the time the game fully launches. So I will certainly take another look at the game once it's fully released, but the demo just didn't really leave a particularly great impression for me. The next demo I took a look at is Echo Point Nova. This is a first-person shooter by Greylock Studio, who are the developers of Severed Steel, which is a game I really need to get around to taking a look at. I've had a copy of it for a while, just haven't gotten around to it yet. But anyway, Echo Point Nova is a first-person shooter with a heavy emphasis on movement and, to a somewhat lesser extent, platforming. It's a bit of an odd one. You're just going across a whole bunch of floating platforms, or really islands, and you traverse these environments using a variety of movement techniques, from basic running around and jumping, to using a hoverboard to really gain some speed and momentum and slide along a bunch of longer areas, to being able to use a grappling hook to propel yourself up and use certain special abilities that will allow you to launch yourself high into the air, or things like that. There's also a fairly basic character upgrade system where you get skill points and you can put those into some passive bonuses and such. And as you continue to explore the environments, you'll gain access to new weapons, new movement techniques, and new special abilities, the last of which all occupy a single slot in your inventory, so whenever you want to switch to a different special ability, you have to go into your inventory and just swap out your currently equipped special ability for one of the other ones. And because some of the special abilities are required to continue continue traversing the environment, sometimes you have to just stop whatever you're doing, swap out your currently equipped special ability for the one that will allow you to progress, and then continue on your merry way. It does seem a bit odd to me that they would set it up in such a way to where you have to slow down and swap between your different abilities depending on the environment you're in, as opposed to being able to hotkey them all so you can just quickly use whatever ability you want to continue on. But maybe it's something they'll sort out by the time the game launches, or maybe it's more deliberate than that, it's hard to say. Beyond the movement, special abilities, and loadout, however, the rest of the game is fairly basic. They do have some level of destructible environments in there, which is pretty cool to see, but apart from that, the shooting mechanics are just fairly basic first-person shooter mechanics. The enemies all follow pretty basic archetypes, at least the ones in the demo anyway, and they're not difficult to bring down, so the game's not especially challenging, and you'll get through the demo fairly quickly. Aside from just looking kind of cool, the world doesn't seem to have a whole lot going on in it, and the story itself just doesn't really exist, at least not in the demo anyway. So really my main concern with Echo Point Nova is whether or not it has staying power. As in, does it have a neat core gameplay loop, but the rest of the game doesn't really support that core gameplay loop? Kind of like what happened with Trepang 2, where it has a really fantastic combat loop, but the rest of the game just doesn't hold that up, so the entire thing suffers for it. Is Echo Point Nova going to be kind of the same way? Well, bit hard to say there, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it, and when the full game's out, I'll give it a try. Next up, we have the demo for Garde, which is developed by Fireplace Games and is slated for release in August. It is a rather light-hearted, swashbuckling action game where you use your sword and the environment to dispatch your foes, all in a manner that you would expect from something being heavily inspired by absolute classics like Zorro. It's got a very colorful aesthetic that's very pleasing on the eyes, it's got a nice sense of humor, and while the combat is overall fairly easy, well, with it clearly being based on the style of combat popularized by the Batman Arkham games, the use of the environment as an integral part of said combat, and the fact that it is such a lighthearted game that is based on classic swashbuckling fiction, does help to make what would otherwise be a fairly weak combat system actually still manage to be engaging. Now I should note that the demo did crash on me, and there's not a whole lot of content in the demo. You have a very brief section of story, which is really just a glorified tutorial, and then there's a brief sampling of the arena mode that you can mess around with for a bit of extra action, but by the time I was through with the demo's content, I was pretty pleasantly surprised by it. I don't think it's necessarily Game of the Year material, even if this is exactly your kind of game or anything, but it does have an awful lot of charm, and I'm actually looking forward to the full release, so I'll take another look at it once it's out. And the last demo I took a look at is Fortune's Run. This is a game that I've actually been keeping an eye on for quite a while, and it's being developed by Team Fortune and is supposed to be released in September, so we'll see how that goes. But the way the game is described pretty much captures your attention immediately. It's described as a classic FPS with undertones of role-playing in the spirit of Deus Ex and I Divine Cybermancy, featuring the campy tone of space operas and titles like Metal Gear Solid. That's a hell of a description, and the gameplay footage that they've shown off has looked very promising, so I was pretty excited to get my hands on the demo and give it a try. And immediately I started running into odd things. Some of it, I have a feeling, is just related to the fact that it's currently not finished and they're still sorting out some things with the user interface. Things like the options menu being a bit clunky to navigate and the settings themselves not necessarily making all that much sense because some of them are in strange values that don't correspond to anything that you're really familiar with from any other game, which of course makes it kind of difficult to determine exactly what those settings do, but you can kind of muddle through it. But once I got past all of that, then I got into the game proper, and that's where things started to get interesting. Before you even get through the tutorial, you already are introduced to the fact that some things in the world are interactive and aren't necessarily related to just running around blasting enemies in the face. For example, one of the very first things you can do is play basketball with an NPC who is infinitely better at it than you are. Does it have any significant impact on the game? Not really, it's just kind of a neat feature that they chose to add in because it helps to flesh out the world a little bit more and gives you something interesting to interact with that isn't just running around blasting enemies. And it's indicative of the kind of world and level design that is on display with Fortune's Run. They went out of their way to develop the game so that the levels you're wandering around in don't actually feel like video game levels. They feel like a real lived-in, sprawling industrial world that you're only getting a snippet of. And it's not just in the environmental interactions, things like being able to put rations and other food items in a microwave and heat them up for extra health, or finding items placed in believable locations, or finding various door codes and such that are placed on notes in believable locations, and so on and so forth. And while that may not necessarily seem like all that much, it's actually something that's rather difficult for most developers to pull off, so the fact that Team Fortune has been able to do that is really impressive. That said, there are a few issues here and there. The first of them is that sometimes the environments are a bit confusing to navigate. It's not always clear exactly where you need to be going in order to actually progress to the next area, because this is still a linear first-person shooter when you get down to it. It's just that the levels themselves are more open for you to explore and find secrets and stuff in than you would normally expect. And sometimes you'll just notice that you're basically going around in circles and there must have been something you missed, but it's not always obvious what you missed. Sometimes it's things like a vent tucked into a corner or even maybe the floor, and you just walked over it or past it and just didn't even notice it. Now that doesn't mean I'm saying that the developer needs to go out of their way to make sure that all the areas are easy to find. Obviously, encouraging exploration is good, but they should definitely do more to make it so the player is at least aware of what it is they need to be looking for, rather than just wandering into an area, getting a bit lost, and going, okay, what the hell am I missing? Other times the navigation can be outright frustrating, most notably with regards to things like jumping and platforming, because there's quite a lot of that in this game, and the margin for error is pretty slim in many cases. So there are certain sections of the game that basically just become a quick save, quick load simulator rather than anything else, and that can just be very irritating. And speaking of quick save and quick load, that's another thing that the player needs to be made aware of a bit more keenly, because they do throw in a message of, hey, I've been auto-saving up to this point because tutorial, but now you're on your own, make sure you use quick saves. But you don't understand necessarily that the quick save, quick load feature is as vital as it is until it's a bit too late. Because as it turns out, not only is auto-saving just not really a thing in the game, but you can also die very quickly and easily, both from, of course, falling off ledges and such, and by the enemies just absolutely shredding you in very short order, even on the medium difficulty setting. I mean, sure, you do have the focus ability, which allows you to slow down time for a very brief moment in order to be able to sort of dodge projectiles and get a nice shot lined up on an enemy, but that only helps so much when they throw quite a few enemies at you all at once, and those enemies can do absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage to you. You find out very quickly, the hard way, that Fortune's Run is not messing around. Even on the medium difficulty setting, it can just be downright punishingly difficult if you don't play it very carefully. And while I don't really have a problem with difficulty in games, what I do have a problem with is when that difficulty is not properly communicated to the player in advance, so they know what they're getting themselves into. Because sure, the game has quite customizable difficulty options, but when the game doesn't really give you much of a frame of reference until, frankly, it's too late, it's hard to really tailor those difficulty settings to what would really be best for the player. And to make matters worse in that regard, when you go through the tutorial in this game, you're certainly introduced to all of the core mechanics, things like being able to jump off of walls, being able to crouch jump to get to higher ledges, being able to reflect projectiles back at enemies using a swipe of the katana, the way the healing system works, because unlike in most other games, you take damage to different locations and then you have to heal those specific locations using the medical items that you find, as well as how the stealth system works, which is basically crouch and move in shadow and enemies won't notice you as easily, and of course how to use inventory items like grenades. What you don't necessarily expect is for the test at the end of the tutorial, which can be completely skipped by the way, is actually pretty punishingly difficult, to the point where it would probably make a lot of players just quit the game entirely because they feel like if they can't beat the tutorial, then there's no point in them continuing through the rest of the game, even though the rest of the game is actually a bit more forgiving than the tutorial is, which is really weird to say. It's just a generally quite frustrating experience because there's actually quite a lot to like about Fortune's Run. Like I said, the world feels really cool to wander around in, and of course the combat, once things really get going anyway, is actually quite satisfying, at least when you're not just being hammered into the ground by the game's weird difficulty spikes and such. It's just that there's a lot of stuff that's really not adequately communicated to the player about how difficult the game's going to be, what it's really going to demand of the player, whether things actually are optional or not, how to do certain things like the ability to put food into microwaves and then heat it up to get additional health points back, which is a bit unintuitive because you think, well, how do I get the item into the microwave? There's no obvious option for it when all you have to do is stand in front of the open microwave and go into your inventory, right-click on the food item you want to heat up and select drop, and then close the microwave, which is just a janky way of handling that. And none of this is helped by the fact that there are things that just don't make a lot of sense in the game. Things like the way the options menu is set up to where you're not really going to understand the various settings that you're messing around with, or the really weird stuff like the fact that the shuttle that attacks you, which is just a gunship really, is somehow more resilient against rockets than it is against the assault rifle that you get access to. The assault rifle takes it down really, really quickly, but the rockets do barely any damage to it. That just flat out doesn't make any sense. And all of that leads me to the conclusion that while the demo of Fortune's Run was certainly very promising and there's a lot of really cool things about the game, there's still an awful lot the developers need to work on before it's actually ready for a full release. Now, I believe that the planned release date in September is actually for early access rather than the full release, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. But from some of the stuff I've been seeing, it does seem like the developers are rather open to feedback. I mean, even with regards to the demo, they've been looking at feedback and determining what they want to do with that going forward. So, rather than being disappointed by the demo and ultimately being concerned for the future of what was seeming like a really promising game, I've more just had my cautious optimism approach reinforced here. I still concede the potential the game has, but now I know for certain that there's definitely still work to be done, and while it's not quite there yet, there's a very good chance that it will be by the time the game hits 1.0. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. I will, of course, be keeping an eye on Fortune's Run throughout the development, as I've been doing this entire time, really, and I am still looking forward to the full release. I just hope that they sort the issues that I encountered in the demo out. And that about wraps it up for my thoughts on the whole Summer of Gaming thing, as well as the Steam Next Fest demos that I did get a chance to mess around with. Definitely a few promising titles that I'm keeping my eye on, and some that I'm actually really looking forward to, but overall the things that got shown off this year were pretty lackluster as far as I was concerned. Admittedly, I'm not overly bothered by that, because I still have a massive backlog of stuff that I need to catch up on, so I'll be kept busy regardless. It's just a bit of a shame that over the next year or so, there's not all that many upcoming titles to look forward to. Well, we'll get there when we get there, I guess. At any rate, thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for bearing with me during all these rambles and the delays and such on this video. This video ended up going up a lot later than I thought it would, so thanks for bearing with me there. But as far as what's next for the channel, well, back to the regular schedule, of course. Doing reviews, MTOs, DW plays, that sort of thing. So stay tuned for all of that. If you like the content I make on the channel, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Links in the description if you're interested there. But I'm just going to go ahead and get right back to it. So I'll see you all in later videos.